Due Process, awarded 9 Emmys, including the 2005 New York Emmy for Outstanding Crime Reporting Programming.
We've raised the level of security at our ports. We've raised the level of security in our airlines. We've raised the level of our security at our borders.
He's been Secretary of Homeland Security for 14 months. And whether it's his handling of immigration or counterterrorism or even Hurricane Katrina, he's making no apologies. Michael Chertoff, our only guest on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.
He heads what may be the most unmanageable department in the federal government, a massive bureaucracy cobbled together from 22 separate agencies, everything from the Coast Guard and immigration to FEMA and counterterrorism. I'm Raymond Brown, and the head of that department is a man we knew well here in New Jersey, but now the rest of the country also knows Michael Chertoff, especially in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. But you'll know him a lot better after this half hour of candid conversation with Sandy King.
Raymond Mike Chertoff used to be a frequent guest here on Due Process. Now he's based in Washington, traveling around the country and the world, and doing a job that some experts think would be too much for any one person. But we've never wanted to talk to him more. So when he said he'd give us a half hour on a quick trip to the College of New Jersey, we grabbed our cameras and headed for the campus, where the conversation ranged from coping with the constant threat of terrorism to the culpability for Katrina. Secretary, we haven't seen you much face-to-face in New Jersey these days, but we read a lot about you, probably more than you would like. And the one thing that's been clear about the last 14 months is it's been a rocky road.
Well, you know, this job has a very broad span of responsibilities. Pretty much anything domestically that's likely to be a crisis, other than a purely economic crisis, is going to have some interaction with the Department of Homeland Security. So, as I knew when I came into the job, there'd be a lot of challenges. Some of them would be foreseeable, some of them would be less unforeseeable. But it's been a tremendous experience, and I've gotten to work with a great group of people.
So let's start with Katrina, one of the not foreseeable crises. How do you deal with the extent of criticism and Monday morning quarterbacking and second guessing that you've had to put up with?
You know, I think it's in the nature of our system that you do get a lot of looking backwards and Monday morning quarterbacking. And one of the things, of course, that was important for me throughout the event itself was to make sure we continue to look forward to things we have to anticipate, as opposed to spending a lot of time looking backward and trying to evaluate things that had already happened. I think when you look at Katrina, you have to begin with the sheer magnitude of the storm, which is unprecedented in this country. 90,000 square miles were affected. That is the size of Great Britain. At the height of the mass movement, the evacuation, approximately 1 million to 1.5 million people moved out of the area. That's the largest mass migration in American history, except for the Dust Bowl. But the Dust Bowl took place over a decade, and this took place over a week.
But you didn't obviously anticipate that kind of storm.
Well, I think, you know, at the extreme, of course, it was foreseeable, like any extreme situation is foreseeable. But it's clear that the planning that had been put in place at the local level, state level, and at the federal level was not sufficiently well developed to deal with something this extreme. So we had to take plans that maybe work in a traditional disaster, even in a significant hurricane, and we had to adapt it to really a double disaster, because you had a hurricane that was followed almost immediately by a failure in the levee system, which apparently was a design problem or a building problem.
So let's go back 14 months. You're unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Great press, praise from both sides of the aisle. Then Katrina hits. You're being called incompetent. Maureen Dowd attacks you weekly. Paul Krugman says you're not a mensch. How does all that sit with somebody who's had great success from law review on?
Well, first of all, I mean, if you define your success by what Paul Krugman and Maureen Dowd say, you're in trouble from the start. But when you go into a job like this, because you know you're going to be dealing, by definition, with crisis situations, you know you're going to be dealing with situations where you're going to have to make tough choices, and the choices will be sometimes where there's no good alternative. You're picking the least bad alternative. I think it's inevitable that you're going to get criticized. The only way not to get criticized would be not to do anything at all and basically not take the job, or would be to try to cater to everybody and make everybody happy, which I think would ultimately be a failure. To do this job properly, you have to manage the risk. And that means you've got to apply your efforts and your resources to those challenges which have the highest consequence and the greatest likelihood of coming to pass. But that means you're not going to give a little bit of something to everybody. And that means there are always going to be some people who are disappointed because they want a piece of the pie or they think their needs ought to be met. And I think it's inevitable that that disappointment will give rise to criticism. And unless you're prepared to live with the criticism so you can make tough choices, I think you really don't belong in this job.
But you do concede that there were major failings in your department's response to Katrina.
I think there were both great successes and some significant failures. Let me give you a great success story. 40,000 people were rescued during that week to 10 days by the Coast Guard, by FEMA working with state and local responders, and by other agencies of DHS. Now, the original prediction for what would happen in a catastrophic hurricane was 60,000 deaths. In the end, there appear to have been between 1,200 and 1,300 deaths. And while that's a terrible loss of life, 40,000 rescues, 40,000 people walking around who would have perished, but for the fine work of people at DHS and other agencies, is a huge success story. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, I think there was more delay than there should have been in terms of the secondary evacuation. I don't know that the delay caused a huge loss of life, but it certainly caused a lot of anxiety and stress and suffering. And that's something that we've worked very hard now to prepare ourselves to deal with in this upcoming hurricane season.
More lives could have been saved. Would you concede that?
You know, it's hard to tell, Sandy, because we assume, of course, an awful lot of people died in that first surge of flooding. People who didn't leave or who couldn't leave, who got trapped in their houses. I don't know to what extent even a flawless response would have significantly impacted on loss of life. And you have to remember that a hurricane of this magnitude is never going to proceed like clockwork. You're always going to have challenges getting to people who are going to be trapped in their attics or trapped on roofs. You're going to have problems evacuating people who are congregated in a superdome, which was never built to be a mass evacuation shelter, and which is difficult to get to because you had a number of the roads around New Orleans that were basically washed out by the hurricane. So I think we could have shaved 24 hours, maybe 36 hours off some of that evacuation time. That's clearly something we need to be able to do. There was clearly a problem with communication, and there were all sorts of elements that we've improved in the last 6-8 months.
So the next question is, we're coming up on hurricane season again. If a disastrous storm should hit again, you can do it better? We
can do it better. It requires not only, of course, federal government to do a better job, but local and state government has to do a better job, too. I've been down in the Gulf just this past week. I've talked to the governors of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We've talked very candidly about what their capabilities are and where their gaps are, and I've asked them to be sure by May 1 to let us know what they can handle and what they don't think they can handle. And if they can handle something, they ought to be upfront about that, and then we ought to be able to step in, and then they have to support us, of course, and they have to give us the benefit of their authorities and their assets to support what we're going to do.
You've conceded that you were hardly an expert in storm disaster relief. You are something of an expert in anti-terrorism, and one of the charges has been that you were so distracted by feeling that the counterterrorism mission was so vital that you let things like FEMA kind of get out of your line of sight. Is that fair?
Well, first of all, I don't think you can say one is distracted by counterterrorism. There's no question that there's no priority that's more important to the country than making sure we are defending ourselves against terrorism. And particularly things like biological attacks, because we'd had that anthrax episode in 2001.
Which we still never got an answer to.
Right, we still don't have anybody charged in that. Radiological or even nuclear attacks. I mean, those are, I'm not going to apologize for spending a lot of time focusing on that, particularly because those were the areas where we were the most behind where we should be, that we had to build up from scratch. Hurricanes we've actually done in this country for 20 years, and we do have a good reservoir of capability and expertise.
So did you think that was an area that you didn't have to give so much personal attention?
I think it was an area that I went into with the understanding that we had a lot of experience. We did have some really capable people in FEMA. I think there were some problems with the top leadership, which I think became evident that first week, and then I moved to replace Michael Brown with Admiral Allen.
Who says, of course, that you were the problem.
And, you know, my experience generally is when I have to remove somebody or when I've had to put someone in jail, usually they tend to become critics. So, I accept that when you make a tough decision, you're going to get criticism from those who feel that they're unhappy with the outcome. But the fact of the matter is when we put Admiral Allen in from the Coast Guard, things got a lot better. So, you know, I think this is an area where fundamentally FEMA knows what to do in the ordinary hurricane. But here there was really a hurricane and then a levee collapse. And there's no question that that was an incredible lesson for everybody, not only for us, but for the Department of Defense and all the other agencies of the federal, state, and local government about the magnitude of what one can face in a real catastrophe.
Let's move on to the terrorism question, since that is the most important question that faces your department on a daily basis. What kind of progress have we made since 2001? Are we actually safer? Are we actually better prepared?
There's no question we're much safer and much better prepared, but we still have additional things we need to do to get to the state we need to be. We're safer, first of all, because we really have done a lot of damage to the enemy, taking the war to them in Afghanistan and other places overseas. We've killed or captured a lot of their leadership. That really has a significant impact on their ability to conduct operations, particularly operations of significance. I don't mean just a single IED. I mean something that would be truly earth-shattering in terms of impact. Second thing we've done is we've raised the level of security at our ports. We've raised the level of security in our airlines. We've raised the level of our security at our borders. We now have a fingerprint system so that every immigrant or every visitor who comes in puts their fingers on a reader. We can check them against databases to see if they're terrorists, either known or even if we've picked up their fingerprints doing an investigation, we're going to know that. So we have done an awful lot to raise the level of security since 2001. And then I'll be the first person to say there are a lot more things we need to do, and we need to, you know, finish the job of getting those things done with some degree of urgency.
I want to talk about the ports, but let's first go back to what you said about taking the war overseas. You know that the argument is made that you've actually created more terrorists by taking the war to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I just think the facts are totally the contrary. The attack on the embassies in 1998, the attack on the Cole in 2000, the attack on New York and Virginia in 2001, those terrorists were carrying out those attacks without any provocation from us. What provoked them to attack us was they didn't like our way of life, and they have a vision of where they want to go, which would involve the domination of a radical, almost fascistic ideology that would dominate the lives of men and women. So that wasn't anything we instigated.
But you don't think we're more hated in the Muslim world today than we were even at the time of 9/11?
I think that the people who were willing to carry out these acts did so without our being anywhere near Iraq at the time they carried out the attacks. They may use the rhetoric of Iraq, But, they were using the rhetoric of Chechnya, they were using the rhetoric of our having defended Kuwait against the attack by Saddam Hussein in the early 90s. I mean, there's always a rhetorical device that the terrorists can use. But the reality is the intensity of the war they declared on us was evident back in the late 90s and the early part of the century. It didn't wait until Iraq to get accelerated.
Could a 9/11 attack happen today? Could it be successful given the protections that you've put in place?
Well, if you're asking me, can there be some kind of an attack? The answer is sure.
I'm asking you, could there be airplanes turned into missiles and flown into
I think that an actual replication of 9/11 is extremely unlikely, because I think we've clearly put into place measures that would protect that. Among other things, we have locked cockpit doors now. We have armed air marshals. We have clear rules in which pilots and crews understand you do not open the door even if people are being threatened in the back. We have better coordination in terms of our air defense system,
But then
in terms
do
of
they move
monitoring.
on to other areas,
right.
biological and otherwise, and how afraid should we be?
Well, so now you get to another issue, and I think we have to divide the world of attacks into two categories. One is the high consequence attack, radiological, nuclear, biological. And I think there we are working very hard, that's really our top priority, to prevent it, to protect ourselves against it, and certainly in the case of a biological attack, to develop a rapid response capability that would mitigate the damage. And I can tell you, even in the year I've been here, we've made a huge amount of progress. We've got radiation portal monitors, for example, deployed in a lot more ports now than we had a couple of years ago. We'll have almost 100% coverage by the end of next year. We're doing a lot in terms of our biological response capability. And that's where our taking the war to the enemy overseas and incapacitating them in Afghanistan and other parts of the world really is attacking their ability to put together a very complicated technological attack. Now, the other issue is, could someone mix a bomb in the bathtub and go out and blow up a subway station like London? And of course, that's always been a risk we've had in this country. This happens to be, as today, the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. That was a homegrown fertilizer bomb that was made and caused an awful lot of damage. That's very much harder to protect against, because there it's very localized. It may be inspired by a radical agenda, but in fact the preparation may be just a couple of people carrying something out. So there we need to continue to work to hone our intelligence, to make sure that we are protecting ourselves and hardening our security. But we also have to recognize that that kind of an attack could happen, and there's no guarantee against it.
But before we leave the ports, firstly, isn't that still an area where we're greatly vulnerable? And second, I need to ask you about Dubai, because you came out and said the Dubai deal was a good deal. And let's start with how vulnerable we are.
Well, we've done a tremendous amount since 9/11. We are in the process of deploying, and will have deployed by the end of next year, radiation portal detectors at all of our ports, and also in a significant number of ports overseas. We are continuing to push the inspection process out at the port of loading, as opposed to having the inspection take place here, by entering into agreements with foreign countries that allow us to identify high-risk containers and get in and inspect them before they get loaded. We screen 100% of containers that come into the country for risk, and then we inspect everything that is high risk. One of the things we're doing now is and I was out in Asia a couple weeks ago, talking to the terminal operators about the next layer of security, which is actually beginning to put X-ray machines overseas at the major ports, so we can actually X-ray all the containers that are going to be loaded and destined for the U.S. So as we add these layers of security, we've already gotten way above where we were before 9/11, and we're going to close that gap in the next months and year.
With time winding down and so much more to talk about, quickly, why did you come out so strongly in defense of Dubai, and why does that seem to be in opposition to the general public's response, the politicians' response?
Well, of course, I'm not political here. I'm trying to look at the facts. And the facts in this deal were, we had gotten an unprecedented commitment from this company to give us an ability to hold them to a higher security standard and give us greater access than we can demand from any other company that operates a port terminal. So we actually had an elevated ability, a greater ability to hold them to a higher security level than we would get with a normal a terminal operator.
So was it just the public's misunderstanding and the politicians playing on that?
You know, I think we probably could have done a better job of making a point early that we ultimately did make, which is there was never any question about outsourcing our security. At all times, Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection had and were going to have total control over security. And if there was any question at any point in time about the company or any other company not playing ball with us, as I said once, you know, we have guns, we have boats, we just stop the ships from coming in. So I think this is an area where, frankly, if we fell down, it was in the public education process.
With just 2 minutes left and so much to talk about, let me ask you about the controversies that continue to rage over Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, alleged violation of human and civil rights by the government in the name of counterterrorism. Are you still as satisfied as you were the last time we spoke that, in fact, the government was still on the right side?
Well, Abu Ghraib, of course, was a very bad thing. And I know there's a process now underway where people are being charged in the military system and being tried, and I don't want to comment on an ongoing legal process. I think fundamentally...
Guantanamo, domestic surveillance, all of those other questions.
I think that...
Detentions.
Well, I think that, in fact, and of course, everything is tested legally, and you know, the court will have the final say on it. But I think, in general, we've been very balanced about the way we've approached making sure that we recognize the real enhanced threat, the need to be able to take steps to prevent the threat from being carried out, but also not going overboard and getting ourselves into a position where we seriously compromise civil liberties. I mean,
Do you think they've not been seriously compromised?
I don't think they've been compromised. I think we have. I know there's disagreement. Some people want to can reasonably take a position. We've gone a little too far here, a little too far there. But I don't think there's any demonstrated example, for instance, of us targeting someone because we didn't like their political beliefs, or people being punished because they've expressed views that are hostile to the government. I mean, the kinds of things you've seen, frankly, in the past, even under President Lincoln and President Wilson, where they were going out there and targeting people who were expressing negative views on the war. We haven't seen any of that. There haven't even been any serious accusations of that. And I think that's a measure of how responsible we have been.
Although I'm sure you're working 16, 20 hours a day, when you have a moment to sit back and think, do you sometimes say, I had a dream job on the Third Circuit. I should have stayed where I was and had a really good life, instead of taking this on and getting really beaten up? You know,
I lived through 9/11 at the Justice Department. I was very involved in the response to 9/11. And for me, in terms of my whole career of public service, I've never been given the opportunity to serve in something more important than the war against terror and protecting this country. I mean, this is, for my generation, what World War II was for my father's generation. And I don't know how one could say no to the president if the president says, look, I think you can make a contribution here. So it's true I've chosen something that's tougher than perhaps sitting in chambers and doing important, but nevertheless a little bit more evenly paced
No
work.
regrets?
No, I mean, this has really been the opportunity of a lifetime. I mean, I can't say that there aren't frustrations or that it's wonderful to be criticized, particularly if you don't agree with the criticism, but the opportunity to work with an unbelievably talented group of people who are very dedicated. I mean, I go out there, I meet the Coast Guardsmen, I meet the police agents who work with us. I meet the people who are out there with FEMA, who are far away from home, who are spending 20 hours a day, putting themselves literally physically at risk as well as under all kinds of stress. And to be privileged to be with them and serve under the same flag, I think that's the greatest opportunity I've had in a lifetime of public service.
So regardless of the heat he continues to take for his running of the massive department, the Mike Chertoff we saw was cool and confident. And although he says he can take the criticism, he was not quick to criticize himself. He defends his own actions, even on Katrina. He defends his president. He defends what some see as encroachments on civil liberties. And as we saw, without even being asked, he defends the war in Iraq.
Sandy, a quick question. With all the criticism and, quite frankly, with the rumors that he might leave, is it likely that he's going to stay in this job until the end of the president's tenure?
He says he's not going anywhere. He has no intention of resigning. And why would Bush want to push him out? It seems to me that he gets more than his money's worth with Mike Chertoff. He gets somebody very smart, very experienced, and as we saw, very loyal.
Sounds like you think he'll stay. We'll test that theory. With our thanks to Michael Chertoff, that's it for this special edition of Due Process. But we hope you'll join us next week for more core questions of law and justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
I mean, do you feel any safer?
No, I don't think the federal government has done enough to protect us since 9/11.
I think a little more has to be done. I think the people themselves has to be working together. I don't think the government could do it all.
I was actually working in New York on September 11th, lost a good friend in the World Trade Centers, and so no, I don't think that enough has been done in terms of protection.
I feel a little bit safer, but I'm sure the government can do more.
We're not a closed country, so we've always been vulnerable, and now that we're aware, they can actually be. Awareness is a good thing.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.